Hello, I'm Anjali. I'm part of the team at Archives at NCBS. I welcome all of you to today's Archives talk. For those of you who are new here, the Archives is a public collecting center for the history of science in India. We collect, preserve and make accessible to the public archival records related to the history of science. You can visit our digital archive on our website, archive.ncbs.res.in. We're also open to the public on all weekdays between 10 and 5:30 p.m. Do drop in if you haven't already. Our team would be happy to show you around. Today, Dr. Sonia Ashmore will be presenting her work on Dhaka muslin, detailing its political history by looking at the influence of its makers, powerful rulers, foreign trade, and colonial interests. Dr. Ashmore is a London-based design historian interested in Indian textiles. Over to you, Dr. Ashmore. Thank you. I have this.
Okay.
Yeah, you can start here. Okay.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for coming and for inviting me to come here. I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian, so I may leave your technical questions unanswered, but I'll do my best. In this talk, I will I'll present one of the Indian subcontinent's most remarkable textiles and try and outline the ways in which it acquired a political importance belied by its insubstantial appearance. Made in humble circumstances as part of localized rural economies, it became an unlikely symbol of wealth, status and economic strength, and an important feature in the increasing power of the English East India Company, itself the basis of the British Empire in India. So I'm claiming a lot for a very light fabric. To start with, I've just put these pictorial maps showing the sort of wide variety of Indian textiles that are produced. Muslin is just one of many marvellous textiles. And also on the left, there's a map of Pakistan showing embroidery styles. So this hardly conveys the sort of great range and wonder of Indian textiles, but just to put the Bengal muslin in context. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London, down at the bottom here, where I worked for some years, has one of the largest collections of Indian textiles from South Asia in the world. They've got more than 10,000 objects. I should say that these were mostly bought, not pillaged, or donated to the museum. So this place was the start of my own journey into muslin and other Indian textiles. The muslin producing areas of India were in what we might call undivided Bengal, here. And on the right there's a close-up of the areas of Bengal now in Bangladesh that were the key producing centres. Geography explains this because the watery rivers areas around Bengal, around Dhaka, had a rich alluvial soil which was ideal for growing a particular variety of cotton, which I'll come to in a moment. One of the old Indian cotton varieties. So Dhaka became the capital of Mughal Bengal, with wealth largely created by muslin, by its muslin trade. It was ruled by the Bengal Nawabs, who made a capital in Murshidabad, also north of Calcutta, which in the 18th century was said to be at least as rich as the city of London, and that was partly due to the muslin trade. Defeated by the British at Plassey or Palashi in 1757, Bengal effectively became under the rule of the British East India Company until it was replaced by the British state in 1858, with Calcutta as its capital until 1911 when it moved to Delhi. At one point, the British Bengal Presidency covered a vast area of northern India. Oh, I don't have a map of that here, but it was covered far more than Bengal is today. It went up to the Himalayas, Odisha, and part of central India. So it's a rather kind of all-encompassing title. I didn't want to put too many maps in. So known locally as futi carpas, the fibres of tree cotton, or Gossypium arboreum of variety neglecta, was the key to making this very soft fabric. The fibres of the tree cotton were distinctive because it had relatively short fibres, and when they were hand spun together, you got tiny little joins in the yarn, which were minute but give the fabric a particularly soft touch. And that's not my imagination. I did ask the weaver about this, and he said, yeah, absolutely. You don't get the same with machine-spun yarn. So muslin is a plain weave cotton, here on the right. Oh, right, back one. So it's basically the warp and the weft just go one over, one under. It's very simple. There's no twisting of the threads or anything. And it was made in very simple pit looms with a hole underneath for the weaver's legs so that you'd work the treadles. And this is a 19th century image, but really the pit loom is very much the same today. It hasn't changed really at all, except its construction is a bit more sturdy looking. So muslin came to be prized as a fine cloth and the symbol of the wealth of Bengal. So to weave fine muslin took a very long time, which I'll come back to. So under Mughal rule, it was highly appreciated. And the Akbarnama, or Book of Akbar, which was the official chronicle of Akbar's reign, listed everything in his empire. It was a sort of inventory of his empire, including all the textiles he had and all the clothing he had. So it's an extremely detailed and accurate record, unique in that way. It was commissioned by Akbar, written in Persian by his court historian, Abu al-Faisal, who you see here presenting the finished work to the emperor. And as you can see, what are they both wearing? Muslin. The apparently simple white muslin cloth conveyed authority, perhaps purity, without the usual embellishments of royal clothing. It wasn't at all sparkly or weighed down with gold. It was saying the opposite of this. I'm powerful because I can wear this absolutely transparent fabric that was very expensive to produce, incidentally. The finest cloths were made in royal karkhanas or workshops, which are exclusive to the courts and were quite strictly controlled. The weavers weren't allowed to work outside these workshops, so they had guaranteed employment, but they were tenured in a way by the job. So here is Nur Jahan, wife of the future Emperor Jahangir, holding his portrait, and again they're both dressed in transparent muslin garments. The transparency and impracticality of this cloth really indicates that it was for an elite political class, because you couldn't afford to wear or dress like that if you were growing rice or working in the fields or doing daily tasks. This was a fabric for people who were able to live a life of leisure and be looked after. So the portrait on the right of Hassan Reza Khan, a much later portrait, who was minister in Awadh, later became the court of Lucknow, is also dressed in muslin. And this was a typical portrait of many of the courtiers and rulers of the time, typical way that they would dress. It shows the ubiquitous appearance of muslin as court dress in India, so it shows status and power, essentially, which is very different from what it showed when it began to be the dress of young ladies of England 100 years later. So Bengal muslin was exported beyond India long before the British trading company, the European trading companies arrived. And it was known in ancient Rome, although there are no material survivals of this, for obvious reasons, very delicate, Again, it was a luxurious, expensive fabric, and people complained about the amount of Roman gold that was being sent to India to buy this muslin. And it was also sent to the Ottoman Empire. And of 15 portraits of the Ottoman sultans, they're all showing, who ruling from 1359, they were all showing wearing these vast muslin turbans. So again, it was a status thing, and it was a cause of complaint by the treasury and by people in the Ottoman Empire that they were spending so much importing Bengal muslin. So there was some muslin made in Turkey at the time, but most of it actually came from Bengal, we think. So Britain wasn't the first European country to establish trading posts in Bengal. You probably can't read all the dates, but this shows the Portuguese came first, then the Dutch, British, Danish and French. And they established first on the west coast, Surat, Goa first, and then eventually made their way up the east coast to the Bay of Bengal and up to up the river, up the Hooghly. It was very, it was difficult terrain, Bengal. It was swampy, it was felt to be dangerous, you were far from home. It was a difficult terrain for Europeans, so I think it was why it was, the British were very reluctant to go there at first. But then they heard that there were these treasures here and these wonderful things to be obtained in Bengal, and cupidity overcame nervousness. However, it was Britain that had the greatest impact on muslin production in Bengal. So to go back to 1600, Queen Elizabeth I, here on the left, contemporary of the Emperor Akbar, granted the East India Company exclusive trading rights in the Indies. Part of it an expansionist policy in competition with Spain, which was making conquests and getting a lot of gold from South America. So she wanted to compete with the Spanish, that was the big rivalry at the time, and so saw India, the Indies or India, as a great opportunity. So, you know, to us today it's extraordinary that one country can claim exclusive trading rights over another, but at the time it seemed to be what you did. So here we see Elizabeth standing ambitiously on a map of the world, because they also went to the Caribbean. And from its origins as an ambitious trading company, the East India Company became eventually increasingly militaristic and imperial, as you can see from the coat of arms here and the director's chair, both of which you can see in the British Library in London. So the English East India Company established trading posts in Bengal, a trading post in Bengal in 1651, and like the other European trading companies, eventually set up factories or warehouses where goods intended for export were deposited, sorted and packed. As well as silk and muslin textiles, the company was involved in other lucrative exports, such as saltpeter for opium, which was potassium nitrate, which was used to, saltpeter for gunpowder, which was, you know, obviously extremely important to them, and indigo production and opium were other major exports from India. And the conditions of production of these commodities became effectively near to slavery. So nothing to be proud of there. The Dutch, French and Danish East India Companies also established bases in Bengal, and ever seen as a source of great riches. And the picturesque remains of some of these centres can still be seen today, for example in Serampore and Chandanagar up in Bengal. And this painting of the Dutch East India Company here has actually got, which you can find on the internet, it's got sort of amazing detail of what actually went on in these places, so quite worth having a look at. So, from the rural village in Bengal. This is a 19th century photograph of a typical Bengali village. And, you know, apart from the fact that cars and scooters are motorbikes, and the houses have got tin roofs, and not that different in rural Bangladesh today, I would say, in certain places. So as the East India Company's trade grew, so its buildings became grander, and in 1806 the East India docks were built in London, down here, to accompany the growing number of ships that were bringing goods from India. They've now all been built over in a sort of luxury flats and office blocks, so the kind of, as it were, romance of that period is now almost entirely gone. Sales of the goods were held in a sale room in East India House here that's now been replaced by a big financial building. So by the late 17th century, enough muslin had been imported into Britain to concern manufacturers of English cloth who made fabrics out of wool, linen and silk. Most of the silk was imported, but there was some homegrown silk. And laws were passed to prohibit many Indian cottons, such as chintz, such as the painted chintzes from Muslin, which were extremely fashionable. Somehow muslin escaped these rules, but there were a number of very fierce prohibitive taxes. So, and a trader in 1696 is saying Indian muslins and silks are becoming the general wear in England. So it gives us a date, which is interesting, that it's become really common to have muslin, because muslins of various qualities were exported, not just the very fine ones. And there was a guidebook published to the kind of muslins that you could buy, and to how well they washed and how well they wore and so on. So there were a whole range of muslins were exported to England. And it was said, fashion is truly turned to which, the dearer and scarcer any commodity, the more in mode. 30 shillings a yard for muslins, that was a lot of money, and only the shadow of commodity when procured. So you were spending a lot of money on nothing, as it were. So they did dislike this. They thought people should wear the homegrown cloth, and that comes up with, again, in different circumstances. So the East India Company became increasingly unpopular in England on account of its monopolistic practices. It wouldn't let anybody. There was a certain amount of private trade that went on, but most of the import was done through company ships that they absolutely controlled. They'd made the investment and they controlled the trade. And also, people didn't like the ostentatious wealth of the returning nabobs, as they were called. So there's an English version of the nawab, people who'd made money in India and came and built mansions in England, of which there are still some left. What is England now? A sink of Indian wealth filled by nabobs, wrote the writer Horace Walpole in 1773. It was considered altogether rather vulgar new money, rather like we might consider Russian money in London now, I think. So the embellished gap, so here is returning not a nabob, but a ship's captain, Captain John Foote. And he returned to England and had his portrait painted in this marvellous muslin gown, embellished with gold decoration. And the interesting thing about this portrait is that we have the actual garment still survives. So we can, very unusually, we can match the garment to the portrait. And this may have been given to him as a departing gift by somebody, but here he is, sort of dressed up as an Indian, there was a certain introduction of Indian fashions into England in this way, it had already come in through the wearing of chintz gowns. So after the Battle of Plassey, or Palashi, in 1757, Robert Clive, I seem to have turned this off. I turned this off. Sorry. Did I call this? Oh, okay. Robert Clive became governor of, oh, and I think I've gone to no. Okay. Robert Clive became governor of Bengal, and the East India Company effectively became a tax collecting company, held in place by its army, rather than a trading company. So, the company became increasingly political. The protocols and ideology established the idea of India, and indeed the entire East, as being a subservient source of riches and resources for Britain. And the painting on the right, which is in the Foreign Office in London, still I think, epitomises this mindset, the East offering its riches to Britannia. And this increasingly became the policy of the company was not to import finished goods from India, but to use it as a source of raw materials, including cotton. So this map just shows more or less the expansion of British rule in India, which started out these pink areas here and then gradually takes over most of India except for a few princely states that negotiated their independence for a certain time. So this image shows a weaver in a Mughal karkhana or workshop with his daroga or overseer. So the British were really able to take over this karkhana system, I think, because it was already in place, a very fixed, organised system of workshops. But they made increasing demands on the weavers. They restricted their autonomy and reduced many to debt bondage through the conditions that they put in. If you want to know more about this, a Bangladeshi scholar called Hamida Hussain has written about it in great detail, how that system works. So in 1772, a former company servant called William Bultz wrote a scathing attack on the way in which the company managed its investments in Bengal. And as you can see, this is his complaint here, that every manoeuvre of those who govern the English East India concerns, and particularly in Asia, seems to have been calculated with a view to monopolising the whole interior trade of Bengal. To effect this, inconceivable oppressions and hardships have been practiced towards the poor manufacturers and workmen of the country, who are in fact monopolised by the company as so many slaves. So, you know, it's not just modern sensibility that's been recognised this. Already at the end of the 18th century, people were really getting quite angry about it. So, yes, to go back to this, the weavers were, the company put more and more pressure on the weavers because you could get an awful lot of muslin in one ship. I mean, there are records of a ship containing more than 10,000 pieces of muslin, but they probably had to have other cargo as ballast, but that is a lot. So they sent millions and millions of pieces, worth millions of pounds, to Britain. And the other East India companies, the French one also did so, but not on the same scale. The weavers were paid advances for their work, but couldn't fulfill the increasingly demanding orders satisfactorily, so the quality went down. So they would be fined, putting them into debt. Although this was already based on pre-existing production systems, it was formalised by the company, which effectively used the weavers as units of industrial production, rather than as the skilled artisans who produced the product that contributed substantially to its fortune. So it's the kind of goose, killing the goose that lays the golden egg to some extent. In Europe, meanwhile, fashions responded to romantic ideals and inspiration from the classical past. The English romantic poet John Keats was inspired by the values of classical Greece, so he wrote this poem called The Ode to a Grecian Urn. The German poet Goethe was inspired by classical Italy, and the French philosopher Rousseau prescribed going back to a simpler, more egalitarian life, effectively a call for more freedom. So this sort of thing was the thinking, was the background to revolution, which comes along in a moment. And the theme was expressed in objects, such as this Wedgwood vase, 1790, and in clothing. Fashionable society women began to dress in the Grecian manner. So they go to fancy dress balls dressed up as if they were Greek statues or admiring Greek statues. You know, very different from the very formal, highly structured dress that had been worn until then. So it was quite revolutionary to wear that. Quite radical, I mean. At the Petit Trianon in Versailles, where the Queen Marie Antoinette had a little farm, where she sort of played at being a farmer and had animals and cows and things, she liked to dress in what she called a rustic style, so away from the kind of court dress that you see on the left here, in which you could, according to written accounts, you could hardly move. It's difficult to get through a doorway, for example. You had to wear these shoes that were impossibly tight, very uncomfortable for dancing in. In fact, it was a sort of miserable kind of outfit to have to wear, but that was the style to show that you were important, an important person at court, or that you were the queen. Again, you know, it's wearing dress to show your status. But the portrait, so these two portraits are by the same French artist, a woman artist, unusually, and on the left she shows this formal portrait, Queen with a rose, which shows her admiration for the rustic life and gardening and so on. And on the right, she's wearing the notorious Indian muslin chemise dress, as it was known, which caused as much of a scandal as the extravagance of her court wardrobe. So Marie Antoinette was criticised for wearing these extremely lavish and expensive clothes, but she was also criticised for underdressing and, as it were, going out in her underwear. So she didn't win in a way. So it could be argued that this wardrobe mistake in muslin contributed to the downfall of the French monarchy. Just a proposal. According to the historian Caroline Weber, by the summer of 1780, one of Marie Antoinette's favourite ensemble of the Trianon was a white muslin shift known as the gaule, or chemise, which her dressmaker had copied from the Creoles and colonialists' wives, unable to wear silk in the Caribbean heat, in the tropical French colony, more colonies, of Santo Domingo, formerly the island of Hispaniola, now the Dominican Republic on one side and Haiti on the other. So they dressed like this because it was cool and comfortable, and it's said that the smart French ladies used to send their lord wear white dresses to Dominica, the Santo Domingo, to be laundered because they came back so white. Anyway, whether that's true or not, the style was soon published in the now influential new fashion plates like the one on the right. And these popularised styles in a way that is, at a speed that they'd never been sort of popularised before. So our artist, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who I mentioned earlier, herself dressed in muslin, rather similar to the Queen's dress, and natural unpowdered hairstyles, instead of the kind of hairstyles that were powdered and went up about a metre and had chips on top of them and all that sort of thing. You represented yourself in a natural way, rather according to Rousseau's principles, if you like. And interestingly, so she represented not only herself, but persuaded her aristocratic patrons, besides the Queen, to dress like this for their portraits. So she was quite an influential woman, I think. Her representations of dress are almost like those of a modern fashion photographer in popularising style. She herself had to leave France during the Revolution because of her association with the monarchy and aristocrats. In 1789, before that, however, she painted this splendid portrait of one of Tipu Sultan's ambassadors who went to Paris to seek support from King Louis XVI, because the French were supporting Tipu Sultan against the Mughals and against the British. This was unfortunate timing as the French Revolution broke out in that year, so he didn't have much luck and went back to India and got murdered by Tipu Sultan for being unsuccessful. But in the meantime, we have this wonderful portrait of him wearing his muslin jama, and Vigée Lebrun actually had a dinner with him and his colleague, who was also dressed like this, and she sort of confirmed her respect for this fabric. So muslin was heavily promoted by the East India Company in England, just as they had promoted chintz beforehand, which had become banned because it threatened British textile interests, as I mentioned. And at this point we see that muslin, worn by both men and women in India, becomes an essentially feminine fabric item of dress in Europe. The unsuitable climate in Europe also made cashmere shawls very popular to stop you freezing to death in your muslin dress. And you can see it's a very, compared to these courtly styles that we saw, it's a very simple style, close to the body, quite revealing, not very much support from underneath, very different way of dressing altogether. So muslin itself was not in itself a revolutionary fabric. How can a fabric be? But its appeal ensured that it outlived the revolution in France, becoming the favourite fabric of the Empress Josephine, wife of Napoleon. The simple, unstructured style suited to muslin appealed to revolutionary ideals as being unpretentious, despite the cost of muslin. Revolutionary ideals of simplicity, as well as to the romantic notion of being closer to nature, even if the fabric itself was a luxury. So on the left we see a woman called Teresa Cabarrus, known then later as Citizeness Talia. You became known as a citizen or a citizeness. You dropped any formal titles after the revolution. She came in from a Spanish noble family, led a colourful life in France during the Revolution, met the future Empress Josephine whilst temporarily imprisoned on account of her noble background. She subsequently used her position as the wife of a leading revolutionary, rather violent man called Talia, but she used her influence to help many people escape the terror and the guillotine, and afterwards became a key fashion leader in Parisian society. One could say that she dressed like a fairly liberated woman in muslin or light cotton here. Always difficult to tell from the portrait exactly what the fabric is. And on the right, muslin is seen as suitable wear for the first woman to ascend in the new technology hot air balloon in Paris in 1798. And I couldn't think of anything more unsuitable myself, but there you go. She's a citizen, Henri she's known as, waving the flag, and up she goes. It was a great public event. Josephine Beauharnais, who was born in the Caribbean and went on to marry Napoleon Bonaparte, was also a leader of fashion in France. As I've mentioned, we'll come back to her, but here she is dressed in this sort of simple classical style. And to make the point, there's a sort of classical statue in the background and a frieze behind her. This is one of her dresses, surviving muslin dresses, which is in the Château de Malmaison, where she lived after she was divorced by Napoleon for not producing a son. And here she again is a sort of classical goddess, almost dresses in classical style on the right, with her hair in little ringlets and classical reference jewellery and a draped shawl. Very much unlike the court costume that we've seen previously. The revolution notwithstanding, Napoleon reinvented himself in imperial style, replying to the criticism that luxury for the rich to criticism that luxury for the rich provides the essential for the poor. In other words, promoting the idea of trickle down, so those who spend at the top will eventually, some money will reach the people down below. He wrote to his sister, "I recommend you ensure that only silks and linen cambric are worn at your court and that you exclude cottons and muslins." He's very specific because they were imported. Napoleon wished to support the French textile industry and reputedly tore muslin dresses from the backs of his wife and her daughter. Before the revolution, 75% of French silk workers were said to have lost their jobs on account of Indian cottons and muslins being preferred over silk. So, in a way, you can understand his point. Again, muslin becomes a focus of political controversy. Nonetheless, so this painting by David of the coronation of Napoleon expresses perfectly the sort of how he sees himself as a grand emperor, not as a humble revolutionary. And he dresses in, and it's all silks, satins, velvets, and court dress, just the sort of thing that was supposed to have been done away with. Yes, I was going to say that despite Napoleon's edict, Josephine preferred muslin, and her wardrobe accounts for 1809, which exist in the Victoria and Albert Museum, record her having 93 muslin dresses at one time, plus accessories, and she had a very costly cashmere shawl habit to go with it. So the accounts are all there, they're quite fascinating. So the spread of new fashions abroad were in part due to the habits of fashion leaders, and what we now call influencers, I suppose. France was the leader of fashion, so everything came from France, really. In England, the Duchess of Devonshire, who was a friend of Marie Antoinette and a leader of fashionable political society, describes wearing a muslin gown sent to her by the Queen of France. And so she was a real fashion leader, and people copied her. Not all muslin wearers were wealthy fashion victims, however. Mary Wollstonecraft, seen in the middle, in either light cotton or perhaps not muslin, but similar. She was the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and was herself the author of The Vindication of Rights of Women, of the early feminist manifesto. She said, "Dress should neither distort nor hide the human form, but rather adorn the person and not rival it. In other words, it should be simple and follow the contours of the body." The fashion magazine spread French fashions to even more middle classes in Britain, and English magazines often use French fashion plates in the business of promoting new styles. And one such reader might have been Jane Austen, a famous novelist, because in her novels and correspondence show her to be a keen consumer and observer of fashionable muslin and its symbolism. And she writes about her characters wearing it, and they're always wearing it to make some point. And she also writes about shopping for it in her letters to her sister. So muslin adapted to changing fashions in the West, ensuring continued demand. On the left there's a white muslin wedding dress. These were particularly fashionable at the end of the 18th century. This one worn by a 17-year-old bride in 1807, and the fabric was likely to have been woven and embroidered in India. An asymmetrical embroidery on the front of the skirt is so reminiscent of a sort of either a sari, you could say, or a toga. So there's a little classical reference or an Indian reference is built in there. And on the right, some years later, half a century later, you get a Victorian-style cotton muslin dress, probably made from English muslin, which we'll also come to, with a completely different silhouette. So we've moved completely away from this naturalistic shape. The bustle with beetle wing and metal thread embroidery. The vogue for body-clinging clothing has passed, and the beetle wings were imported in huge quantities from Burma, now Myanmar, through India where they were used, and there was a sort of hobby in England for making things with beetle wings but they weren't done with such great skill as by the Indian embroiderers, I have to say. By the late 18th century, there was open conflict between the interests of the East India Company and those of British cotton manufacturers, who stated that they had invested more than £1 million in machinery and mills as part of the Industrial Revolution, obviously, and employed 100,000 men and women and more than 60,000 children in muslin and calico manufacture alone. Obviously, that's not something we'd be proud of today. And we might compare this with the plight of handloom weavers today, being put out of work by fast fashion and industrial processes. So here we've got they have very skilled handloom weavers in Scotland. So here's a picture postcard of a weaver in Scotland, beginning of the 20th century actually. And then really what happened to production, a muslin factory in Glasgow. So they, curiously enough, had a big export to India, but from the samples I've seen, they look like muslin curtains rather than muslin for dress, much cruder. So the success of Indian muslin in the West was to be almost fatal. It was imitated first by hand weavers and then by machinery. Some of it was pretty rough and thick, as you can see, but some, especially from Scotland, you see bottom right here, where the weavers were extremely talented, was of very fine quality, but none of it ever compared with the muslin from Bengal, because they didn't have the right yarn, for one thing. So the Victorians were very keen on measuring things and classifying and measuring their empire, essentially. They wanted to know what they got. And they spent a long time trying to measure the fineness of muslins, compare them. And although, technically speaking, they reckoned that some of the best English muslins could compare with the Bengal one, they just didn't feel the same, so they didn't have the same quality, they weren't made from the same yarn. So here's some examples of quite coarse muslin, advertising itself as British muslin here, and manufacturer's pattern book here on the right, and a dress in the Glasgow museums here, which was clearly, whose fabric clearly matches the pattern books that remain in Paisley. So this is a Scottish muslin dress imitating Indian muslin. As Britain came to see India as a source of raw materials to feed her new industries, particularly the textile industry, rather than a source of finished goods, raw cotton rather than woven cotton, British cloth flooded Indian markets. This hybrid muslin choli or bodice at the top here as an example. When I first saw this in the Victorian Albert Museum storerooms, I thought, well, that's quite weird. That fabric just does not, I can't imagine that fabric being Indian somehow, that you don't see that particular type of floral design on Indian cloth, at least I've never seen it. And of course what the label says is that it's an example of British cloth suitable for India, and so it was exhibited at one of the international exhibitions as an example of what we could be sending out to India. It may have been probably tailored in Mumbai, I'm not sure. So it epitomises the British government's simultaneous efforts to improve Indian cotton production for their benefit, and yet support the attempts of the British cotton industry to penetrate the vast market of its Indian empire. Clearly, Gandhi's Swadeshi movement was in resistance to these practices. Anyway, the approach of the East India Company and the British government in general contributed to the decline of muslin manufacture in Bengal. So Sonagan, shown here on the right and here, with the remains of the English factory or warehouse, some of which is still visible today actually, all in picturesque decay. Sonagan was a local capital in undivided Bengal, now in Bangladesh, and like Murshidabad, it hosted a royal court and a mint, and was very wealthy. European merchants built houses here that you can see remains of in the 18th and 19th centuries, It's just about being rescued from decay today. Worth a visit should you ever go to Dhaka. The muslin trade and muslin production collapsed over time for many reasons. The pressure put on weavers by the company to produce more and faster, famine, earthquake, change of regime all contributed. Weavers also lost the traditional exclusive patronage of Indian courts. Today, Jamdani muslin is still hand-woven in Bangladesh, and muslin is being revived in Bengal. Attempts are being made to revive tree cotton, in Bangladesh, and which had almost become extinct. And production of Jamdani muslin is based in villages and still uses very simple technology to produce some very fine fabric by hand, although commercial pressure means much production is quite crude and mechanically assisted by jacquard looms, and you don't get the same quality of design as you do with the hand weaving. So I think here political will is needed to support the infrastructure of handloom weaving in the whole of the subcontinent, including Bangladesh. Jamdani muslin, it has this discontinuous supplementary weft. In other words, you weave in the pattern by hand, but it doesn't cross over to the next piece of design. So you have to take your needle in and out, and then, so there's no threads running across the back. So we produce, it looks like a shadow at its finest on the cloth. At the top, I put these two pictures in because the preparatory work is still being done in very similar ways today. It takes a few people to stretch the warps and then starch them with cotton, rice starch. And here's the winding of the cotton onto the yarn onto the reels. The yarn comes from other parts of India now, but these pictures indicate that really muslin is not why it's socially and economically important is that one muslin weaver equals a community. There's not just one person involved in producing the cloth. You need several people to prepare the yarn, the warp, thread the warp threads and so on. So it's a complex operation that used to be done as a self-sufficient ecosystem also. You would grow rice and you would grow cotton, and the family would clean the cotton, prepare the yarn, spin the yarn, stretch the warp and all the rest of it. So it was a kind of closed little system which was very cohesive and worked well. Obviously in modern life things don't quite work like that, but it's still quite a village operation. So superb Jamdani muslins are being handmade today in both Bangladesh here and West Bengal. It's a slow and costly process. The piece on the left took 20 weeks to make, and it was sponsored, and it was made for the Jamdani Festival in Dhaka in 2019. And the weavers said, they were shown patterns of old muslin Jamdani and said, but we can't do this, we don't know how. And they were told, well, have a try, we'll pay for your time, and they produced these marvellous works. So it was very gratifying for everybody. But to produce these commercially is very expensive because the amount of time taken. This one took 2 months, some took longer, and that's 2 men working all day at one loom. Some imaginative contemporary designers are seeking to find ways of using homespun, hand-woven, naturally dyed muslin fabrics for modern markets. Santanu Das, for example, this man here from Kolkata, works with 100 handloom weavers in Bengal. So there are people making efforts, but the scale probably needs to be expanded. The life of the traditional weaver is by no means glamorous or easy. Conditions are basic. The weaver making extraordinary cloth always seems to have been at the bottom of a food chain that profits from his and now her work, and women weaving as well. Yet the handloom industry is still the second largest source of rural employment after agriculture, certainly in Bangladesh. I'm not sure of the figures for India. Climate change is a threat. This village here is 3 meters above sea level, so difficult. A lot of the houses are on stilts, but it doesn't really allow for serious flooding, which is a big problem. So the first handloom census in Bangladesh was in 1919. By 2018, the number of weaving units had reduced by over 45%. So the same people in India have been burning their looms and so on, so they don't see any future in it. So, sorry, one more. Nearly there. So, in India, there's been a struggle to have handloom weavers properly identified on the, enumerated on the national census. So in other words, they don't exist or didn't exist as economic units. So that's an important shift that needs or is either happening or needs to happen. And I should say that handloom is not just about fine textiles, it's coarser weaves as well. So the vast garment industry sector, factory sector, can seem a steadier source of income than weaving, although the Rana Plaza disaster and closures during COVID-19, here, empty production lines, have made this less certain. COVID was devastating for the handloom industry, they lost a lot of business. But there's more awareness of the environmental costs of the fashion industry, which perhaps could benefit handloom. Which would you rather do as a life's work? Political and cultural issues still wrangle, with disputes over GI or geographical indicator of Jamdani in particular, which Bangladesh sees as its national fabric. But on the other hand, the secondary weave is a sort of natural way to weave on any loom. So perhaps it's the actual motifs that really the crucial thing that belong to Bangladesh. The important thing is to find ways to keep the hands working, with weavers in control of their products, with markets for their work, and with prospects for the next generation. Thanks very much.
Any questions?
So that was fascinating. Was muslin always an undyed cloth? Was muslin always an undyed cloth?
Well, it was traditionally white. I think the white, because the white shows the transparency, and then it was embellished. I didn't really want to put in too many images, but it could be embellished in many ways, either like this secondary weave or with, especially in South India, the South Indian muslin, like golden spangles all over it. It could be tie-dyed, bandhani. It could have embroidery. It was in Delhi did beautiful, well, the chicken work. You think of Lucknow, which began probably in Bengal, that white on white embroidery. So white was sort of favoured because it just shows up the luminosity and transparency of the cloth, I think. It can be dyed.
May I ask a question? Probably the yarn that was produced, hand-spun yarn, it also required a specific kind of cotton, right? And that cotton, as I have read, that is almost extinct. And because of the Manchester mills, they had started replacing those by the other cotton varieties. And of course now because of the BT cotton variety. So now in Bangladesh, when the revival is happening, how are they doing the revival? With what kind of cotton are they working?
Well, they import cotton from India, actually, and I think from Andhra Pradesh and other parts of India. And so they are trying to revive this cotton, but I don't know how long it will be before they produce enough to weave with. And I think probably is not, I don't know whether it's possible to measure on what kind of spindle you'll be able to spin it, whether you can use the chaka, I don't know, which is commonly used in hand loom, or whether you'll still have to do it by hand. So the jury's out on that, I think, at the moment, because I don't think they've produced enough cotton to make the yarn, but we'll look forward to that, to see what will happen.
Hi. I was curious to know when you mentioned that muslin was exported to the West, the Ottoman Sultan's warrior. What about to the East? Like, is there any evidence of trade or people, empires in the East buying muslin from India at that time? Like this
Sorry, I didn't quite hear you.
When you mentioned that muslin went to the West, starting from the Romans and the Ottomans, I was curious if it also went to the East, and if there's evidence of empires in the East.
Well, a lot of Indian fabrics were traded to other Southeast Asia, probably including muslin. It's just that the records aren't always there. So there was a big trade, and also in Central Asia. It went to Central Asia. It went to Mecca, to Saudi Arabia, that was suitable for wearing for Hajj. Although there aren't many actual examples, I've only found one actual object from the 19th century, a turban which was made for Hajj. So it was very widespread, but I think the question of finding the records, actual archived records of where it all went, is a job for somebody.
Thank you.
It went to America too.
So I read previously that there was one type of muslin, I don't remember the name, that was regarded as the thinnest of the muslin cloth. And its weavers, the British cut off their hands so that they could not teach their skill to their children.
That's the story, but nobody's ever found any evidence of this. And I think the British were harsh. I don't think they, well, I don't want to be an apologist, but I think probably that would be going a bit far. But it has been suggested that perhaps some weavers injured themselves, so that's, I mean, I'm not trying to shift the blame, but that's one possibility, that they caused some injury so they couldn't weave for these unsuitable masters.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody's ever really come up with an example of the hands being cut off.
Like injuring themselves due to that bondage you mentioned.
I haven't seen evidence of it. I mean, that's just been put forward as an alternative explanation of that. But I mean, maybe it happened, but no one's ever proved it. No one's ever found any account of that happening. I think the British and others could be quite harsh, but I mean, someone may find out, I don't know.
It's a very specific question on one of the photographs that you showed about the citizen going on the hot air balloon. The guy next to her had some papers that he was throwing off. The man that was standing next to her had a bunch of papers with some scribbles that he was throwing out of the hot air balloon.
I think they were leaflets. It was a big public event, and I think, I can't remember his name, but somebody who did these dramatic ones across the channel and so on. Or tried to. It was sort of self-promotion, I think.
We'll try to make this the last question.
You did mention about the climate responsiveness of muslin. It was very climatically suited. So I'm wondering if in the contemporary or in the current situations the narrative changes. Does it become more suitable for rest of the world, all of the world which is heating up? So is there something which came up in the research which shows that the cloth kept coming back into usage or in life in terms of climate.
Muslin is coming back
Yeah.
into usage. Well, I think that, I mean, it's a difficult fabric with Europe, because, first of all, it's quite high maintenance. I mean, I think that, rich people wore it because they had servants. And it's quite interesting that you see very few muslin garments in Europe after the First World War, because I think there was a lack of servants. People didn't have the need to iron and starch their clothes and so on. So, but I think it certainly, there's lots of designers, several designers doing it, bringing it back in India, and they're doing their best. I mean, it's perfect for an Indian climate. And so, yeah, I think
I think I was asking more about in the West,
Yeah.
if there was a resurgence of the material.
a resurgence about it. Well, then, of weaving it to make.
Using it,
Yeah,
whether
yeah.
it's imported, exported, woven there.
Yeah,
but-
well, you see, what happened is it turned into a kind of utility fabric in the West, certainly. So they used it for babies, nappies and things. And it just became a loose, light fabric. And so it wasn't used, it wasn't exported really in a wearable way. I mean, in the 1960s and 70s, when there was a fashion for Indian clothes in the West, there was a thing called cheesecloth, which was a very rough kind of muslin that people, when they made them fit, girls wore that. But didn't really compare with this fine Bengal muslin. It was a loose woven cotton cloth and didn't really wear very well, but it sort of felt good fantasy clothing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashmore. We have tea and coffee at the amphitheatre and we'll continue this discussion outside.